Thank you, comrades. I hope you can hear me well. Greetings from Beijing. Greetings from a very full moon tonight because it's the Mid-Autumn Festival. So one of the big festivals of the year, where we eat a lot of moon cakes and stare at the moon. But I'll just maybe start with an anecdote. I want to thank all the organizers of this conference, CPUSA, and all the panelists sharing the virtual table with me. I was taking a bike ride this night, and I was going to see the Beijing Opera at the National Center for Performing Arts, this gorgeous building. And I was just noticing there were so many families out, where I was on a bike, there were a lot of motorbikes, and you saw little groupings of people and stopped everywhere. And I was starting to see what were they looking at? And everywhere were people staring at the moon, just moon gazing. And the moon was beautiful and gorgeous and full and red. So I think that bodes well for our conference today. But I think for me, I want to start with that because it's quite a striking image. I think it's the kind of image about China and Chinese people that I think through the Western corporate media, you don't get to see. The very human side of what the development of socialism has done for just everyday working people. And in the process of delegitimizing and demonizing China and its rise globally, part of it is also the threat that China poses in terms of what it's done domestically and for its people. And so what I was hoping to do today with our time together is share do two parts in my talk. The first is to share some observations about the Chinese conjuncture, particularly since the 18th National Congress of the CPC in 2012. I also was thinking about that because right next to Tiananmen Square, of course, is the Great Hall of the People, where the 20th National Congress of the CPC will be taking place on October 16th. Because I think that helps us understand sort of the global configuration and sort of the workings of US imperialism with its Western allies, particularly from what China has been doing domestically. And then the second part will be asking some questions more than giving any answers on, what is this global conjuncture we're living in? What does China's rise mean for the construction of socialism and for internationalism, which of course is the theme of today's talk, and for anyone who's on the left and progressive forces of the world and in particular of the global South. So I guess I wanted to go through, I was trying to organize some themes of some of the important changes and shifts since the 18th Congress in 2012. So since President Xi came into presidency. And I think it's almost, we could spend hours on this topic about how much this has been significant in terms of the road to building socialism in China and the trends that have emerged, and also the kind of shifts in direction that we've seen under his presidency. And so the first, I think, is, and already the moderator, our chair, has mentioned, in Tricontinental, I had the chance to do a study or lead a study on the poverty alleviation process in China. And of course, this is, since 1949, the eradication of poverty has been a key aspect of the communist struggle. But I think what is important to highlight is what has happened, particularly in the last 10 years since President Xi came to power. We have to remember, of course, in the process of opening up and reform since 1978, huge strides have been made to lift the economic floor for the vast majority of Chinese people. But when it came to around 2013, there were still large numbers of people, particularly in the countryside, that were still living in extreme poverty. And, we actually, our team had a chance to go visit some of these places in rural Guizhou, which has been historically quite a poor province in southwestern China. And what is impressive about this point is that it's not a wealth transfer scheme, which many countries, I think, have embarked on, just transfer of income or a basic income scheme. But really looking at some of the multidimensional or root causes of poverty. I mean, we're amongst comrades here. We know that poverty is a construction, based on the economic system, but also linked to many factors like poverty, education, healthcare, housing, etc. And So the poverty alleviation, what's called the targeted poverty alleviation campaign in this period was essential to look at these areas, to look where the pockets of poverty, where the economic growth that was experienced more in the cities and in the eastern side of the country didn't quite reach. And what's important to mention is the capacity of the party to mobilize the whole of society, not just the government and the public sectors, but also the private sectors and private enterprises, and of course the party itself, because there's no organizations without the organizers themselves. And in this period, there was a huge mobilization of people, of cadre. Initially, 800,000 people were sent to the countryside to identify who the poor were. In a country of 1.4 billion people, statistics aren't going to get you very far in terms of how you actually understand the needs and the situation of poor households and their realities. So 800,000 cadre were sent to basically do grassroots organizing, knock on door to door to understand what is the situation with the housing, is there running water, do the kids have access to school, etc. And then subsequently, 3 million cadre were then mobilized and sent to live and work in the countryside. I met with some different party members that were dispatched to usually work with maybe 5 families, and you spent years at a time, and at times far away from your own family, to see that this campaign was reached its conclusion. And actually, many comrades actually died in the process because the conditions were very difficult. As you can imagine. And what is important about this moment, and I know I'm going on a little bit about the poverty alleviation, but I think it's worth for us as communists to think more about and what we can learn from this experience, is the reconnection of the party with the grassroots masses, with the rural countryside. Because to be honest, during a long period, the last decades in this rapid economic reform, the connection with the countryside and that rural base with the party was, I wouldn't say lost, but definitely quite weakened. So this was an important part in terms of reinserting the party into the daily life of the masses. And so since then, we've seen, the eradication of extreme poverty that was announced at the end of 2020, which is quite a feat given that this was just when the world was really, really deep into the COVID pandemic crisis. And so China was able to meet that goal despite the challenges. And if anyone wants to read of the study, it's on the tricontinental.org website. And I think it's something worthwhile for all communists and socialists to read. So since then, there have been some important areas of what has been framed as common prosperity in China. Really a shift or a logical next step from the eradication of extreme poverty is to look at the areas of inequality that still exists. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that the increase in inequality, whether it's measured by the Gini coefficient or whether you're talking about between the people from the countryside or the city or from the Western region and the Eastern regions, really amplified over the last 40 years. And so one of the major focuses in recent years is looking at common prosperity or inequality. With really key areas is what we call the 3 mountains that are faced by the working people in China, which is in education, healthcare, and housing. These are big issues right now around addressing the inequality issue. And with this part, I think one of the really interesting things is what has been happening with the, let's call it the reeling in of the excesses of capital. And what has often been termed as a disorderly expansion of capital, looking at the areas where, for example, monopolies have grown or where private capital have kind of really reached a predatory aspect in China. One clear example is, last year when Ant Financial, the group that's led by Jack Ma of Alibaba Group and affiliated companies, was about to launch their IPO to enter the stock exchange of Hong Kong and Shanghai. And this was going to be the largest IPO in the history of capitalism. It was huge. So a lot of interests involved in this one. But basically on the eve of just a few short days before that was about to happen, the Chinese government came in and basically paused that IPO. I'm sure many of you remember the news and even a lot of the fear mongering about Jack Ma's disappearances. But anyways, he's fine and well. But one of the things is really impressive to see was the clear sign that yes, there is private capital in China, but capitalism is not what we have in China. There is still a very clear signs, and especially under President Xi, that capital is submitted to politics, to political power, and to, of course, the party's power. And this, I think, has been really shown in how it's been responding to the tech sector, which is something I think we're all afraid of in most parts of the world, how big of an influence that big tech has in our lives, whether it's through algorithms, the control of data, through the monetization of data, through questions of security and surveillance, and just rights of people. So it's been pretty impressive to see that as one strong move by the government in terms of reeling in the excesses, particularly in the tech sector. And next to this, we've also seen in areas that have also sort of fallen prey to the private sector. For example, last year there was a strong campaign against the private tutoring industry, which over the last 10, 15 years had grown into $150 billion industry. Really, I would say preying on the anxieties of working class parents and families and kids, and trying to sort of get ahead in school. And as a result, it created a very, 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 let's say predatory, again, because that's what it is, industry. And basically the government came in and said, no, education, especially that for curriculum core courses, cannot be for profit. It must be not for profit only. And basically from one day to the next, put a pause on a massive industry and upset a lot of people, including a lot of investors in the stock exchanges in the US. Another area I wanted to just mention is around the environment, which is a really big question, is a planetary question. We know that to become the factory of the world that China came at a huge cost, not only to the working class of China, but also huge environmental cost. And there has been some really impressive work done to not only rectify or let's say restore the environmental damage that came with that period of economic growth. For instance, I mean, now I just recently moved into Beijing, and I would say the first time I came to Beijing was 16, 17 years ago. And just the air you breathe and you see, I mean, I don't think I could have seen the moon tonight 16 years ago. And it's really impressive. Like, I hadn't lived in Beijing before and personally have seen like what I would have named a miracle. And I am a Marxist and I don't believe in miracles. But we've seen huge amounts of air pollution reduction. And one piece of information that I thought was really shocking is that China was able to reduce the same amount of air pollution in the last 7 years as the US did in 3 decades. So there is a sort of leapfrogging in terms of, yes, of course, China grew at a rapid, unprecedented rate, but at the same time, there is a kind of response in terms of when there is a will to react and respond and to correct some of these aspects, it really does do it. Another area is reforestation, which is something I'm particularly interested in. That was a big part also of, generating income and work during the poverty initiative. But in the last 20 years, China has actually become the global leader in reforestation and also afforestation. That is the creation of new forests, not just the replacement of previously existing forests. And so that means that in the last 20 years, a quarter of the forests that were created in the world were actually planted in China. So that's good for the lungs of the world and all of our lungs as well. And this is on the heels of the new direction, which is the announcement that was made last year around the pledge to carbon neutrality by 2060, and which is, I think, quite impressive given that a lot of the European countries have only committed to 2050, and they peaked in emissions already in the 1980s or 90s. China still hasn't reached its emissions peak yet, and we're expected to reach it by 2030 or a little bit before. So I think that's a pretty bold commitment, given that we know in the global south and the developing countries, we bear a lot of the brunt of the environmental destruction and and I mean, just the pollution that was caused in terms of the development of the imperial core. At the same time, we're ashamed for wanting to catch up in terms of industrially or just in development. So that has been, I think, an area of importance in the last few years, of real commitment around the environment and climate question. And I'll just kind of wrap up a couple of points in terms of what we've observed in the last 10 years. And one I think is really important is around party building and governance. Just around the 18th Congress, one of the first announcements that President Xi said when he assumed presidency was that he was going to be out to get corruption or go confront corruption that had really seeped into many parts of society and many levels of government. I don't think this is a hidden secret. The government, likes to actually talk about and openly about the anti-corruption drive. And famously, President Xi said he's not going after just the flies, but also the tigers. And that's what we've really seen since 2012. We've had 4 million cadre party members investigated since 2012. Last year alone, 600,000 government and party officials were investigated. We've had people who are charged and sentenced, whether from the levels of generals to Politburo members to Central Committee members. So very much the flies to the tigers, and that I think has been really important in also gaining, I think, the confidence of the people, because Chinese people could see how much corruption was impacting many aspects of society, and how for many years there was perhaps a kind of blind eye turned to that aspect of governance and society. And I would say that along with the fight against the pandemic had a huge impact, as well as the poverty alleviation work, had a huge impact on building the confidence and trust of the people in the party and in the capacity to govern. I know if you read, the Western news, it looks like, Chinese people were ready at any time to sort of overthrow the CPC or government because we're so unhappy because we have, we're zero COVID policy or something, but that's just not true. I think there's a great study that I like to refer to, which is surprisingly done by Harvard, launched in 2020, that I'm amazed they had, wide access, but they interviewed about 30,000 people from 2003 to 2016, and sort of mapping a little bit of this period, catching the early years of Xi's presidency. And they basically have seen us across the board from all levels of, from the county level to, to the central government level, an increase in the trust in the CPC. And they actually put the trust in the central government at 93%. This is Harvard speaking, this is, and you can just feel it also, in just being here. But anyways, this is the kind of stuff you never get to see in the news. But I think this idea of showing, as much as, COVID has been hard for everyone. I was living in Shanghai during the last series of lockdowns. I was in my house for 2 months. It was very intense. But I think one thing that was shown is the importance of protecting lives over protecting, let's say, your GDP growth rate expectation for the year, which this year the government actually dropped in favor of a recovery that is more in service of the people's needs. And also seeing the mobilization of party members and party branches leading this work in the communities, doing the testing, visiting the families, being present in the daily lives of people, I think in some ways, you could say the kind of poverty work in the countryside and the anti-pandemic fight in the cities kind of work together in this period to really show the capacity and strength of the party to mobilize and also be present to respond to the people's needs. And so I think kind of wrapping that up, I think those trends means there is a general confidence on the capacity of the people, of the party and its government. And what's interesting, I think, for maybe this group to hear too, is I think if for young people, especially growing up or born after the 1990s, there is a generation that is now much more open to socialism. There's a generation that is much more culturally confident, that don't look to the US or Hollywood for answers, that get upset when they see the fake media campaigns and or boycotts that the West is doing, or sanctions, and they're challenging that. They're saying, okay, well, when I don't want my Nike shoes, I don't need my H&M. I'm gonna buy Chinese brands, watch Chinese movies, listen to Chinese music. And there's a kind of interest not only around being Chinese, and I think that's important, not just from a nationalist standpoint, but in terms of what it means to not idealize US imperialism, and from the cultural side, but also because there's a consciousness about imperialism that's re-entered the lexicon of young people today, that had been for many years, I think, kind of hidden or sort of veiled, and that's really heightened since the pivot to Asia. The trade war started under Trump and has only really intensified with the Biden administration. Okay, so I said a lot, and I just wanted now to kind of pivot to thinking about what these sort of the rise in China, and from a domestic perspective, what does it mean kind of geopolitically, and in terms of the China's relationships with the rest of the world. Of course, the world is really big, so I don't have a big ambition to touch on everything. And the comrades before me have also already, I think, laid a really important groundwork for us to understand what's at stake, and how US imperialism and Western imperialism at large is functioning. And one of the things is that we know that this, war path, and it really is a war path, to contain this so-called rise of China is on many fronts. I mean, one of them is around the economic front, and one of the comrades, Hannah, I think you were talking about the shift in trade relations between many countries in the US, or in the countries of the world, with the US now shifting to China in a quick 20 years. And of course, China's economy is fast approaching, or if you count it in purchasing power parity, China's economy has already surpassed the US. So there's that aspect, the economic side. And then there's, of course, the productive side. China is no longer the factory of the world producing running shoes and cheap electronics, but it's also contesting in the strategic areas of high technology, 5G, AI. We have to look no further than to see what happened, how brutal really the measures were against Huawei, one Chinese tech company. And one thing that I was just reading, and we cover in Dongsheng, is I think it's important to talk about science and how much investment in science there is here. In 2020, so just 2 years ago, China surpassed the US in the total number of scientific papers produced. So that's in quantity. And just last year, China surpassed US in the top 1% of papers cited. And that's really important because that's a measure of quality. That's a measure of actually how much the scientific research is being used around the world. And I think that we have to understand that aspect in terms of the science and tech, in terms of challenging US hegemony, US primacy in areas that had never been contested before. And then I think the social aspects already mentioned quite a bit in terms of looking at how China has been developing these recent years. But one also, I think, comparison was quite, I think, kind of left a mark for me, is looking at life expectancy. And I think life expectancy is a really good measure, not only of human rights in a broader sense, but because it captures a variety of things. It captures understanding of, access to healthcare, questions of gender, child maternity care. it addresses a lot of things around poverty and issues that are embedded into life expectancy. So last year was the first time the average life expectancy in China surpassed that of the US. So right now, China's is around 78.2, and the US dropped to 76.6. So the US life expectancy had the largest decline since World War II, because of course we saw the tragic a death of 1 million people from COVID-19. And that actually has had a significant impact on absolute terms for life expectancy. And I kind of went back to look at, just the last 70 years. So in 1949, with the creation of the People's Republic of China, the life expectancy was 35 years. I'm 35 now. This is my life, In the US, it had already reached 68. So that's to say, in 70 years, the average life expectancy in the US for an average person in the US increased by 8 years only in over 7 decades. And in China, it more than doubled. So I think that, when people say, oh, the Chinese people, okay, human rights, there's really almost no measure to human rights and looking at just that fact, that there's, saying that, the Chinese people have lived their best 40 years out of 4,000. And I don't think that's untrue. So, of course, with all these rise economically, socially, technologically, in many senses, we have for the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union, a US that is being contested, that has run uncontested as a unipolar power for the last decades. And of course, go into a big debate about that, but the Soviet Union didn't reach the levels that China is now, whether it's economically. Certainly, most of the world didn't have the USSR as its largest trading partner in 1989. So right now we are seeing the many, many tools in the hybrid war arsenal of the US and its allies to contain China. The information warfare, the economic and trade sanctions that are just increasing rather than decreasing, the military provocations, of course, the highlighted by the landing of Pelosi's plane in Taipei. This is quite dangerous at this kind of escalation. It certainly doesn't serve the needs of the people, neither of the US or the rest of the world, but I think it does say something about US an imperialism in decline, and an imperialism that has its weakness because of its, or fragility because of its incapacity to serve the needs of its people. And that is a really dangerous thing for the rest of the world. I want to point to one publication that's going to be coming out very soon, in a few days, actually, between the Tricontinental Monthly Review and the No Cold War Initiative. And it's called The United States is Waging a New Cold War, a Socialist Perspective. So this is going to be a publication freely available, and I encourage all the comrades to have a look at it. That includes 3 essays, one from John Bellamy Foster, the editor of Monthly Review, that's trying to look at, the threats of nuclear warfare to maintain US's primacy, which really is an oxymoron because no one can survive a nuclear war, but this is sort of where the war machine is taking us, at least we are seeing those signs increasingly. Second essay is from John Ross, who's a British economist, looking at how the military escalation since Ukraine have really heightened the level of danger for the rest of the world. And then we have another comrade, Debbie Veneziali, who is who looks into the unity of the U.S. political elites. This web of think tanks with producers of real tanks, the arms manufacturers, to confront Russia and China. And then an introduction from Vijay Prashad, who's the director of Tricontinental. And I think one of the things that is interesting, not only to map what the US and its Western allies is doing in this moment, but also thinking about what the Global South is doing. What is the response of Global South countries? And I think since the war broke out in Ukraine, we've seen, yes, I think a lot of Western Europe become quite subordinate to the US political hegemony. but not so much in the global south. Over half of the world's populations, or countries that represent half of the world's population, voted or against or abstained from supporting the US in the UN vote of aggression against Ukraine. More than 80% didn't actually endorse the US-led sanctions against Russia. But what we've seen is also, a desire of the US to start a war on multiple fronts, whether it's with Russia via Ukraine, which I think it's a devastating war for all of us who are anti-war activists. But at the same time, trying to provoke, I think, in many ways, a hot war with China. At the same time, there's this desire to sort of take back Latin America. President Biden famously said, "Oh, no, Latin America, you're not our backyard, you're our front yard." I'm pretty sure Latin America doesn't want to be anyone's yard.
Tings, sorry to interrupt, but it seems your audio has cut and we can't hear you right now.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself accidentally. I got so excited. Where did you lose me?
Right at the front yard, backyard conversation.
Yeah, that gets me. I was like, wow, how dare you? So I mean, Biden's Summit of the Americas, utter failure in Los Angeles. When led by Mexican President Lopez Obrador, many countries just refused to attend because we're not going to have a summit of the so-called Americas without Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And I think that was really impressive move to see, okay, attempt to assert a hegemony over a region that doesn't actually want to be anyone's yard. Actually, down the street at the People's Summit for Democracy, there were more crowds than Biden could draw, and their video addresses from, President Maduro, the former Bolivian president Evo Morales. There was the Cuban president Miguel Diaz-Canel. So it was a bit better party and better attended than Biden's summit. And of course, sort of joking aside, I think we're seeing an important progressive wave happening in Latin America. Some question the term pink tide, but let's say it's a kind of new progressive tide that's happening. Mexico, Argentina, Peru, Chile, we have some of the largest economies in Latin America with progressive or left leaders. We had the amazing victory of Colombia's Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez, which I think I don't know how many of us thought we would live to see. Colombia, one of the tightest allies of the US in the region, turned to the left. We have, of course, the Brazilian elections happening, which we will hopefully see President Lula come back to power in October. This will really change the configuration of politics in the region, and hopefully move towards stronger national projects and a rebuilding of regional blocks that have a chance in terms of creating multipolarity and multilateralism in the face of US imperialism and unipolarity. And a few months ago, our Argentina office of Tricontinental published a dossier, which is quite interesting, is called Looking Towards China, Multipolarity as an Opportunity for the Latin American People. So I invite anyone to have a read at that, because it's quite, I think it maps out a clear path or a clear question, at least, around what does Latin American and specific progressive governments want in terms of a shift away from Western capitalist development, and what kind of opportunity does the rise of China actually pose rather than a challenge or a threat. I think an interesting example is a country like Argentina that has come out of these neoliberal years under Macri and a total IMF domination of its economy, where they're now in conversations, recently joined the Belt and Road Initiative. It has the Cauchari Solar Park, which is the largest solar park in Latin America. Lots of agreements with China around nuclear energy projects, with technology transfer, upgrading of the rail systems, and a variety of projects that I think are actually quite interesting for our national development project. This, I think, is raises a questions for a lot of us in terms of what can China possibly offer through some of the different platforms that have been created. And in that, I think, dossier, one of the points that they were making is, of course, what sort of countries, sovereign countries, decide to do with their with whether it's the US with China or any major powers in the world really depends on the people, and ultimately depends on the popular movements and the left progressive forces to help politicize those struggles in creating a national project. It is really important in terms of the organized people, organized masses in the parties, in the trade union movements, in the social movements, to push that project to the left and strengthen that national project, which we've seen really flail in many of the global South countries, of course, under the yoke of imperialism. And then secondly is rekindling this process of regional integration that began, I think, to flourish in many ways after the 2008 financial crisis. And where we saw things like the BRICS emerge, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa in 2009. We saw the Belt and Road Initiative that was established in 2013, obviously led by China, but at this point, there's over 120 countries around the world that have joined. And it's a really important pillar in terms of a possibility for infrastructure or development or technology access for many developing countries. And I want to just touch with that. I think with the BRI is also on the question of Africa. And in Dongsheng, the research collective that I'm a part of, we actually just launched, we've been following the China-Africa question for a long time. And it's a thing I think all leftists need to understand better, because it is one of the areas of contestation and really where I think a lot of the misinformation about or myths around, debt, the debt trap, or around new neo-colonialism, or what China's presence is in the continent. And there's a new podcast that just launched a couple months ago by two comrades, one from South Africa and one from Zambia, Mika and Amadeus. And they're doing a podcast every 2 weeks on China, Africa. It's called the Crane and Africa China podcast. So if anyone likes podcasts, it's there. And we'd love to hear your feedback too, because it's really made for audiences like yourself. But I think for this question is, we're also trying to learn and understand, for countries in Africa. I mean, just the continent itself sees a infrastructure deficit annually of over $100 billion. $100 billion. 40% of the continent doesn't have access to electricity. So when there is a project of Belt and Road Initiative that looks at building ports, building access to internet, we're not talking even 5G, it might be 2G or 3G, just internet. Access to electricity, there is training, there is technology transfer. For many countries, that's just the better option. I know that there's been a sort of battle of acronyms, I like to call it, because since the BRI in recent years, we've heard the Build Back Better World, and more recently from the G7, the PGII, I think it was. But of course, this is, I think, still to be seen how much money they will put to their words, how much capacity they'll actually be able to provide and leading a development initiative for the region. I mean, most of the global South has suffered the really strong neoliberal agenda and the structural adjustment that came with it for many decades to be smarter than just to fall for, nice acronym, which isn't even nice. I Build Back Better Word, it's just bad grammar. And anyway, so anyways, this is one of the ways that we're seeing that contestation. But, and Mika, one of the hosts of the Crane, was saying in a recent interview, it's that, there's a kind of arrogance, especially I think from the global North, to think that, African countries are being colonized by China, as if they don't know, or as if African countries or Africans can't make a choice about a pathway for their countries to develop. And I think that is the neocolonialism. That's the neocolonial attitude that still persists in terms of how we think of South-South engagement and how global South countries can relate to each other and build other platforms and possibilities that isn't around the orbit of the US and its allies. And I think that's what's threatening. And I mean, I could just point to a variety of really interesting, I think, global South-led initiatives. We have the SCO, the Eurasia think I muted myself, which has been essential to, securing stability and security in the Eurasian region. We have the Euro-Asiatic Economic Union, we have ASEAN, we have FOCAC, which is the cooperation with Africa and China. I mean, there's a lot of new multilateral, multipolar platforms that are being generated. And I think this moment is for us to kind of understand, what does China's rise in this global reconfiguration mean? In some ways, there's been a lot of discussion around a new non-alignment. Of course, we don't live in the Cold War in the same senses as we did in previous generation, but certainly a kind of new alignment of forces that aren't necessarily going to bend over backwards to US hegemony and imperialism. That maybe there is, for first time in many years, a kind of pole, another possible pole. So I'm going to just wrap up. I think my time is pretty much there. I guess I want to leave with some questions for us. I don't have the answers to, but hopefully together we can construct them. Is then really what does China's rise mean for the world and for socialism? I think there are going to be lessons and learnings from the Chinese experience, whether it's, I started with a poverty initiative. China has a very unique history, ancient civilization. It has a very unique political system. That's not a model to be copied and pasted anywhere. That's never going to work. But there's certainly lessons, and it'd be a shame to close off the possibilities of learning. And I think a second point is around, what does Chinese rise mean for contesting US imperialism, or a possibility of contesting it, and building a multipolar world. And I think that is an essential question we have to keep putting our minds to, because no matter what, we have to ask, what is the principal contradiction? And the principal contradiction is, I keep muting myself, I'm sorry. And then I think the third point I want to say is, how do these advances and contradictions around building the Chinese socialist project help or impact the building of socialism internationally? I think conversations like this, or a variety of platforms we want to create, is more dialogue between China, Chinese people, between not just the government levels or state structures or party structures, but also people to people communication, to learn, to understand, to exchange, because there is I think a closing space of understanding. And I think as internationalists and as socialists, we must seek truth from facts. And with that, we need facts. One of the reasons we created Dongsheng a couple of years ago, it's just a collective of comrades that are interested in the news, coming from Brazil, Argentina, Zambia, South Africa, and China. And it was really in the height of the media war, when the pandemic was hitting back in May of 2020. And we just realized this war was really was increasing, and the access, even for leftists and progressive-minded people, about China was so hard to find. And so what we started was just compiling news. We just read a lot of the news and started sharing, digesting it, and putting together some newsletters. So today we have two. One is called News on China, which is like a weekly digest of 10 top stories: people's life and culture, agriculture, environment, politics, a variety of things, very short snippets. And then another one we started more recently, which is called Chinese Voices, which is to translate and bring some of the Chinese thinkers, because realistically, a lot of the Chinese thinkers and scholars, or people that influence the life here and society here, don't get any airtime. So we started, reading that and trying to bring some of that might be interesting, particularly for Global South audiences. And I think in many ways, I think the last note I want to end on, in terms of an invitation to all of us to kind of keep seeking truth from facts, to continue with dialogues amongst the left and progressive forces. And I think in many ways, I think many people here say socialism saved China. And I think right now, perhaps like China is part of a process of also reviving. It's going through a socialist revival within China, but also how to strengthen the socialist project around the world. So with that, thank you very much, comrades. It was a pleasure to share my time with you.
Thank you so much, Tings Chak, for a wonderful presentation. You also helped me remember that I did not introduce myself. My name is Dylan, and I am on the CPUSA's International Department. So with that out of the way, we will continue on to questions. We will take in-person attendees walking up to the microphone, and virtual attendees can submit their questions to the Zoom Q&A box. We're going to start with one question from our Zoom attendees. The first question here for Tings is, how has COVID impacted China's economy, as well as recent events in the world? Is it still growing as rapid as before?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Of course, I think generally China's trend around the GDP growth has been declining over recent time, and the COVID has hit it like any other country. I had mentioned briefly, I think, that this year the government decided to at some point scrap the GDP growth targets, and I think that's quite a good indicator of saying, okay, no matter what, through our policies, economic policies, through our social policies, that saving lives is more important. The Chinese government is taking huge initiatives, not only in terms of protecting lives, but how is it to facilitate the economic recovery? And one of the big things is in terms of investment in infrastructure. There was earlier this year a $1 trillion investment scheme on all sectors of infrastructure development. We have a huge sort of highway infrastructure development. So that is the main way of generating income, generating jobs, because with the pandemic, the unemployment rates has increased. And this is particularly for youth aged 18 to 24. And it's reached some of the highest levels it's ever reached. And with a large number of graduates graduating from university this year. So it's a huge challenge. Of course, the government also made huge investments in making sure that people get tested and get vaccines. So just to give you a little anecdote about how I'm in Beijing now, there's no outbreak now, but since the last waves of outbreaks, whether it was in Shanghai, a short one here in Beijing, but some other regions, what has been instituted is mass testing available everywhere in order for you to go basically anywhere. So I have to do a test every 72 hours, a PCR test, not an antigen test, in order to get into a taxi, to go into any institution. And with that, that means the government has to set up infrastructure. So pretty much, I would say anywhere within a maximum 10-minute walk, there are kiosks set up with offering free tests at all times. Of course, this adds a little bit of work, but you can imagine the amount of investment that's in. My numbers are probably like a month or two old, but up around the time at the end of the Shanghai lockdown, the government had spent $45 billion just on PCR testing to make that available for free. So you can see where some of the priorities are. Of course, I mean, one of the big challenges now is going to be to stimulate, domestic consumption. People are in a saving mode. Many people did lose jobs. It's a difficult moment for many people. That's definitely for sure. And of course, we're hoping for when perhaps after the National Congress, now we're testing different kinds of ways around the zero COVID policies, but how to loosen up to certain areas. So that'll be something we'll have to see.
Thank you so much. We will now take a question from our live audience. Comrade, you may step up to the mic.
Hi. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you for speaking with us. I thought it was kind of funny that you said that they were spending $40 billion for COVID and we're sending $40 billion to Ukraine. But the question I had for you was, I know that Xi Jinping actually extended an invitation to the US to join the Belt and Road Initiative. What do you think it takes either for the CPUSA or other communist parties across the globe to initiate that invitation or to join the Belt and Road Initiative for further development?
Well, you know what? You actually caught me. I didn't realize that there was an invitation, so I'm learning something from you today. That's quite interesting. I mean, we have to work together for that because I know that infrastructure is a big question in the United States. I keep hearing from the comrades there about the bridges. Like, I don't have the number, but the amount, the percentage of bridges that are ready to fall apart. So I don't have a good question, good answer for you, but thank you for letting me know about that.
All right, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Let's give a round of applause to Tings Chak.